Welcome to DSEJ Home Classes, dear students. You know, everyone is blessed to have parents. We owe a lot to them, and you might have observed in your homes that your parents they love you differently. Your mother has a different way of loving you, caring you, and your father he has a different way of loving and caring for you. Uh, Today we are um, actually our parents are very much concerned about everything, about the future of their children, the you know everything, whatever is whatever is meant for the development of the children, their development of their personalities. They do everything for the development of their children, and everything which is related to our lives, everything which shapes our personalities, they do everything for us. Today we are going to study second chapter of class 10th, which is titled An Excellent Father, and it is actually um, an extract from a famous novel, Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And Now let us start this chapter here. It's an excellent father, Jane Austen, who lived in 18th and 19th century. Uh, the the most important thing I would like to tell you first about Jane Austen, what kind of writer Jane Austen was. Jane Austen had the ability, to peep into the human nature. Jane Austen had ability to look into the human nature, to understand that human nature, and that's why Austen could, depict the realities of the society of the times, and could understand the human psychology. That's why the characters of Jane Austen are very very living. That's why that's how we find them in the novels of Jane Austen. And it is the characters of Jane Austen, you will find the vices and the virtues, both things in those characters, and that is why I said the depiction of the characters, or the portrayal of the characters of Jane Austen, is very much real. Um, Here, um, An Excellent Father, it is actually a story where you will find different characters, like I have written it on the board. You have Mr. Bennet, who is a gentleman, and who lives with his wife, Mrs. Bennet, and their daughters, and he likes to enjoy the things. And then we have Mrs. Bennet, the wife of Mr. Bennet, who is a kind of, you can say, a selfish, or you can say the main aim of her life is to find rich husbands for her daughters. Then we have the three daughters here, the three daughters of Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet: Lizzie, Kitty, and we have the other one also, Elizabeth also. Then we have Mr. Bingley, who is a rich, handsome guy, who rented this Netherfield Park, which is in the neighborhood of Mr. Bennet's house. And then we have Mrs. Long also there, who informs Mrs. Bennet that this Mr. Bingley has come to their neighborhood in Netherfield Park, and has decided to stay there. And the chapter starts here in the Netherfield Parks, which is it is rented by Mr. Bingley, who is a very rich person. And when he comes there, you see, and the Mrs. Bennet becomes very happy because she has daughters, and she wanted to get her daughters married to young, rich, persons. And when she hears the news of this Mr. Bingley coming to their neighborhood, she becomes very happy, and she informs her husband that someone has come, namely Mr. Bingley has come there, and it is a great fortune for them. Okay, and she also wants her husband to visit his place, and develop certain familiarity with him, so that he might get married to one of their daughters. He might like and love one of their daughters, and one of their daughters get married to him. It is because it is the novel is written in the 19th century, where it was, like you can say, there was a custom that there was a custom that the property property was taken, it was taken by male members of the family, and not by female members. And as we know, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet, they had no son, they had only daughters, and that's why Mrs. Bennet was very much worried about the fortune of her daughters, because they had no son, and property cannot be owned by them, and she feared that their property might be owned by any of their close relatives. That's why she wanted her daughters to get married to some rich person. But Mr. Bennet, he seems, at the very beginning, he seems that he's not interested in visiting Mr. Bingley. He is not interested in getting her any of her daughters married to Mr. Bingley, who was a rich person. It seemed to them at the very first. But there is actually a sort of conversation between Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet about their daughters, about visiting the home of Mr. Bingley. And but Mr. Bennet tells Mrs. Bennet that she should go to visit him with her daughters, and but Mrs. Bennet wanted, in return, she wanted Mr. Bennet to go there and develop certain familiarity with him. And we can see the frustration of Mrs. Bennet, the unhappiness of Mrs. Bennet when Lizzie, one of their daughters, she was trimming a hat, and Mr. Bennet, he tells her that Mr. Bingley might like that hat. But at that particular thing, Mrs. Bennet told him that it is of no use, because we are not going to visit them. Mr. Bennet also tells her that okay, if Mr. Bingley is here, if he doesn't marry our daughter, there can be anybody in the neighborhood. Anybody can come. Any rich person can come in our neighborhood, and he will get married to our daughter. To this, Mrs. Bennet replies that it is of no use, because we are not going to visit any one of them. And similarly, another example, we can see that she is unhappy with the decision of Mr. Bennet not going to visit Mr. Bingley. It is when Kitty starts, coughing, and Mrs. Bennet, she scolds her for coughing, and to that she replies, Kitty replies that it is not for her amusement and that she is coughing, but she was ill, that's why she was coughing. So we can see it seemed that Mr. Bennet was not ready to visit him, but suddenly it appears that Mrs. Bennet comes to know that Mr. Bennet has visited the house of Mr. Bingley. He had paid a visit. When she hears that, she becomes very happy for that, and Mrs. Bennet tells her daughters that you have got an excellent father, and he cares for you, and that's why he visited Mr. Bingley's house. Now they were they felt starting very fortunate that one of their daughters would get married to Mr. Bingley, who was very rich. It was this thing. This is how this chapter ends, and the main thing about this chapter is, which we would like to discuss certain points, the themes of this prose. What is the themes? What are the themes of this prose? So it may vary from person to person or from culture to culture. There are many themes. I have written two of them here. The most important and the main theme is the theme of marriage. The theme of marriage. When you read this chapter, this prose, you will see everything revolves around the marriage of the daughters of Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet. Mrs. Bennet tells Mr. Bennet to visit Mr. Bingley. Why? Because she wanted one of her daughters to get married to Mr. Bingley, who was a rich person. And the whole conversation between the characters is what it is all about. If Mrs. Bennet is unhappy with Mr. Bennet, it is because he is not visiting Mr. Bingley's house. And when at the end, when she becomes happy with Mr. Bennet, it is because he had paid a visit to Mr. Bingley's house, so that to develop familiarity with him, so that later on he might like one of their daughters, and one of their daughters get married. So the whole things, all the things revolve around this particular thing, and that is marriage, which is the main theme of this prose. Then there can be other themes also, like I have written number 2, mothers and fathers, different ways of loving their children. As I told you at the very beginning of this lecture, that mothers, they love their children differently. Fathers love their children very much differently. They have different attitudes. They speak in different tones. They do different things. So in short, they love their children differently, as we have seen in this prose, that how much worried is Mrs. Bennet for her daughters, and it seemed that Mr. Bennet was not interested in visiting Mr. Bingley, but later on at the end of it, we came to know that he had paid a visit to Mr. Bingley, and he was also very curious. He was also very cautious about the marriage of his daughters, but their attitude, their ways were very much different. So they had very different ways of loving their children. You can't say that any one of them loves less, but you can't say that. But the most important thing is what? Both of them, they loved their children, they loved their daughters, but their ways of loving them were very much different. So it was all about this chapter, and I would like to end this chapter by one thing. We have another character, that is Mrs. Long. This Mrs. Bennet, she had an apprehension that Mrs. Long or any other mother might get their eligible daughter who is marriageable. They might get their daughters married to Mr. Bingley. She had that apprehension when Elizabeth told them that Mrs. Long would surely introduce them with Mr. Bingley. But Mrs. Bennet's reaction over it was very different. She told them that she had Mrs. Long has 2 nieces of her own, so she might get one of them married to Mr. Bingley. So it was this thing. All the things, they are revolving around this particular thing, marriage. The main theme of this is marriage, and say it was this an excellent father. We came to know that why was Mr. Bennet an excellent father? Because he showed a lot of love. He didn't show the love in the very beginning of this chapter, but at the end of this chapter, we came to know that he loved his daughters very much. That's why Mrs. Bennet told her daughters that they've got an excellent father. Okay. This was this. We will come with the next video, with the next lecture. Thank you very much.